Hello and welcome to Dev Game Club, a weekly podcast in which two veteran game developers play games from the past and discuss their impact and relevance today. I'm Tim Longo, and I'm joined, as always, by a man whose Sora cosplay is grand prize winner within his own home.
Brett Roxas Duville.
Oh, it's Roxas now. I don't even know who Roxas is.
I know. And neither does Sora until events.
Lore reasons.
Lore reasons. It is, yeah, wow.
Little waypoints.
We can do a little update on that.
Yeah, we should. We should.
Yeah. We're gonna turn to Diablo III in a moment because this is kind of a bonus episode for us where we're just looking at something more recent and talking about how the series has progressed and the impact and all that stuff. But yeah, so I'm basically at the end of Kingdom Hearts 2. I'm to that point where I'm doing all the side stuff, and oh man, is there side stuff in Kingdom Hearts 2.
So they doubled down from the first one on that.
Yeah, I mean, that's not surprising. That's very much a Japanese RPG thing, and especially a Square thing. That, I finished the main story, now there's another at least as much content as the main game that's just side things. Like the example from Kingdom Hearts 1 that you would know is the synthesis stuff.
Yeah.
There's still the synthesis stuff. There's also, on every world, there's a special boss, which is some weird ability thing. Some of that was also in Kingdom Hearts 1, is a little different. There's all of these different missions and like levels of achievement you have to do for them, like, do this for at least 2 minutes or whatever, keep some enemy in the air for at least 2 minutes, or get 5,000 points in some Coliseum thing, or I mean, it's madness how large it is, and yet I keep going. So
so what's compelling you to continue? Is it just your trophy hunting, or is there
It's partly that, although I don't know if I'll platinum this one because there would still be a critical level playthrough in my future. There are 2 harder levels of difficulty above normal now. There's pride or proud or whatever, and then there's critical. And I'm not sure that I'll be able to do that, to be honest. So I probably won't. I don't know. Sometimes I just like to play some of these things to see what inventive new ways they use the mechanics, and I have to look the stuff up to achieve it. Like I don't figure it out on my own.
Oh, it's pretty well hidden.
Well, it's not so much that finding it is hard. It's just figuring out what to do to achieve the goal is sometimes quite difficult. So there's this thing in the Coliseum where you need to go and remember how you had to bash the barrels in Kingdom Hearts 1? Yeah. So there's a similar thing, but you need to get 1,000 orbs, and these things drop a certain number of orbs when you crush them.
Nope.
Burns or something this time.
No, I'm out.
Yes. So you go and you look it up, and it's like, so if you decrease your combos, then that means you have less downtime. It's things like that where it's the systems can be bent in these weird ways. Yeah, it's like how do you take all this huge array of stuff that you know how to do, that you've kind of optimized for your straight line, going to the end of the game combat. How do you tweak that and like remove stuff and put in some other thing maybe you don't normally use, etc. This weapon you don't use maybe because you've got a ton of these different keyblades or whatever. And I really enjoy that, how crunchy all that stuff is. It's just like, that's what that's for. That's to, make it so you can do tons and tons of attacks without having any downtime, which is something I some of that I figured out in the first Kingdom Hearts. I don't know. I enjoy that stuff.
Yeah.
There is a certain amount of just like finish the journal. I don't even know that I can do that on regular difficulty mode. There's so much stuff in the journal. A lot of these challenges are in there, and some of them I'm just like, I don't know if I'll be able to do that. So I don't know. It's just wild how much. I'm just amazed at how much they overstuff this baked potato. So.
Well, you're a self-admitted completionist, and it sounds like not only this series, but this one in particular is really for completionists. I mean,
yeah,
they just
I would say that. Yeah, I mean, and I think that's generally true of Square's JRPGs, but I don't know that I've I don't think I've ever gotten a platinum trophy other than Kingdom Hearts 1
on a Square
on a Square game, on a Square JRPG. There are some from the publisher I think I have, but not in the JRPG space. So yeah, I don't know. We'll see.
It's interesting. I mean, as we sort of pivot over to Diablo, but to compare sort of Western and Eastern RPGs, it is interesting again to see. Well, I guess that one's not as modern. I guess that one is still pretty. When did 2 come out? I was still PlayStation 2, right?
It's yes.
Yeah. Okay. So maybe not as relevant
towards the end of that era, but yes, yeah,
not as relevant of a point. But I just feel like there's something in their sort of. I guess the cultural way that they make these games, that there's always those, like that chocobo thing that was in Final Fantasy IX that I never even found, that you found. And like, there's always these extra efforts that they put into adding, basically fairly orthogonal things to the base game, where in Western RPGs, it tends to be more along a theme or systemic or, procedural or something like that, there's not, or an expansion pack would come out that kind of adds more of the same essentially, but it's not like you're playing a whole different, type of thing. So I don't know. No, I guess we've talked about this with JRPG, each of them,
we talked about this with Final Fantasy IX a lot in terms of like they made special gameplay for this and that.
Like the card game. Yeah. We've talked about this before, but yeah.
Yeah. And so I wouldn't say they add a lot of things that are new, but it really is sort of like expert level play and understanding of the systems. Like to be the person who could figure this stuff out, I'll never be that guy. I mean,
you have to like trial time,
but I think there's a lot of the people go and they figure out like, okay, what does that mean really? This to do this thing that they want me to do. What are the things that prevent me from doing that easily? What are the and what are the things that would help me do it a little easier? And I think it takes a little sort of thinking outside the box often of, well, normally I'm just trying to do the best I can for combat or whatever.
It's like a min-max. Somebody's going to go through and figure out
and you just have to go and like figure out the other constraints and what the ideal thing is. But I will say, and we can use this as a fulcrum to turn to Diablo III, is that one of the things I've always admired in game design, and one of the things I think can be or in game development in the industry, one of the things that I think can be really rewarding, both personally as a developer and financially often as a publisher or as a developer, a studio, is to be generous with your games. Mm-hmm. Just put as much as you, and this is a game this is a reissue. Not all of this stuff was in the original game. So some of this stuff is, well, we remastered it and then we added a bunch of other crazy stuff. And that was true.
That's right.
Kingdom Hearts 2. Yeah.
Did they do like
all that stuff?
Because one was like Kingdom Hearts 1.5
final mix, right? Yeah, and this is 2.5 final mix.
Oh, okay.
So there is stuff that is definitely added here. A lot of the synthesis stuff got really expanded from 1 to 1.5 or 2 to 2.5. They added new types. They added another dungeon that was totally different and dropped new synthesis materials in both, etc. So there are things that they just add on that they're just like, where can we shoehorn in some more content? And I think that's actually probably rewarding on a personal level for the developers, because I imagine it's kind of dreadful to a degree to just go and up-res everything, right? I mean, and tighten up whatever. I can't imagine that's tons of fun. I've never worked on something like that, a straight sort of remaster / reissue. So I couldn't really say. But to me, I just look at that and think, well, I don't know that I would enjoy... I don't think that the challenges there would be the sorts of things that would really kind of float my boat. So this is a way for them, with some hindsight and having played the game a ton, to go and say, you know what, I wish we had been able to do, this kind of crazy thing, and to add that stuff in. I had somebody ask me about Republic Commando years ago, like back not long after it came out. Like, how much would it have taken to add like as many levels as were in it again, like just a whole nother campaign sort of thing, like that many more levels? I'm like, well, a lot maybe, but also not. Like, I mean, so once you have everything working, there's a certain extent to which it's like, yeah, that's a lot of work, but it's not as it's incrementally more work. It's sort of linearly more work, not sort of the huge curve it takes just to get to the point where you can ship a thing at all. Right?
Yeah.
Once you have all that stuff established, I mean, that's one of the things that's really frustrating when you break up, when studios break up or shut down or whatever, is that, all that knowledge of how to make that thing is gone now, right? Those people knew how to make the thing that they made. They're really good at making tons of it, and now that's gone, and it's going to take a while before somebody else can do that thing like they could do it.
Man, if we were able to do a Republic Commando 2 follow up right afterwards with that team, it would have been
something.
It would have been something. Yeah, we learned so much, and it's that way with any game like that. And though I didn't stick around at Crystal, I think it's a good example because Rise of the Tomb Raider, was heralded as a much better iteration of the first one. Largely a lot of the team did stick together and they iterated, on it and made a better game because of it.
It's an excellent example. Yeah, they definitely, it's a much bigger game. They found ways to shoehorn a lot more stuff into it, and if you want something really big and rich, right? Yeah, once you know how to do the thing, it's like, well, now we just do more of it.
Yeah, you have a formula and you have the basic challenges of in that case when we were rebooting, the basic challenges are sort of out of the way, and you're just figuring out the nice iterative steps to take rather than reinventing the wheel, and that's often the challenge when you're starting over from scratch, either with a new team or with a new design. But yeah, I mean, a small version of this that wasn't stellar, but when we did the Wii version of Tomb Raider Anniversary, we added a bunch of Wii-centric, sort of mini game sort of stuff to the game, which was fun because it was a sort of a remaster or a port, but it was fun to kind of try to think outside the box for that platform. Yeah. So that was just a small example from my past, but not necessarily a remaster. Once you have that stuff down, and I think Diablo III is a great example of this because as we played on your stream, we actually didn't play the campaign at all, and I made Brett, jump into just adventure mode with a seasonal character and talk about taking, sort of a foundation of a game in pretty much every way. And you're basically, they basically are doing a remix of their game. Already a procedurally generated game, in almost every way. And then, they create these things which, they call riffs, and it allows them to kind of break rules of fiction and narrative or what have you. And they just kind of smash everything together. And it just is the perfect canvas to grind and just endlessly play that game. And talk about being generous. I mean, that's still, at least the business model that they have for that game is still just, buy it once and you're done. And it, as far as I can tell, fairly endless. And I have fallen deep down that hole again on the Switch, at least. And it's just fun to jump in and not kind of care about a lot of the things that you might care about in a campaign. And just let yourself be free.
Yeah, I mean, to me, there's a couple of things there. I mean, one is I sort of view a lot of the Final Fantasies and whatever that I play as kind of being similar to me as just keeping playing Diablo 3. Like, you drop in, there is a story. It's some big thing that ends up you fighting a god or fate or something, some force of nature or whatever. And it's fine. It's just this huge power fantasy with a story and some quirky characters and maybe some weird side gameplay type stuff. And I get another one. I'm like, oh yeah, I'll play another one of those. and that kind of can be my forever game in a way. I feel this way about some, board and card games. I mean, we play Dominion. I have 10 box sets of Dominion games. I've probably not even seen all the cards that we have in terms of playing them.
Are those expansions? Twice. What do you mean?
Those 10? Are expansions. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So there's. I didn't know there were that many.
I think there's at least one more that I don't even have.
Wow.
But yeah, they were just coming out one after the other for a number of years. They might still be printing them. I don't even know. I haven't checked that in a while. I just was like, hey, you know what? We need to start playing some other games. But it's just sort of a comfortable thing that you can drop into, and the Diablo mold is so strong. I mean, it just is very. It's a great, especially now with these riffs and what have you. It's a great game to be like, I'm going to throw on my podcasts and and listen to something and do this, or I've got the ball game going on in the background and I'm going to play Diablo 3, on the handheld mode or whatever. I might find me doing that a little bit this coming baseball season.
Oh, I love it.
Yeah, I mean, it's really easy to drop in, and because there's not a story aspect of your brain maybe being engaged, especially in this sort of like mix and match mode, you have this opportunity to kind of have that sensation that you really like, and know going in that it's like, well, yeah, I'm just doing this just to have something to do with my hands, while I'm
pure endorphins.
Yeah.
I mean, as an interesting correlation, I think, to our previous series with Diablo 1, which was essentially fairly light on lore and story, and ended up becoming, as we talked about back in the day, that sort of co-op, just dungeon runs and corpse runs and butcher runs and such. The funny thing is, it's a little bit come full circle with adventure mode in Diablo 3, because that's a sort of, a sort of similar distillation of that same concept that 1 had. It's just 1 didn't have it there, to begin with, for the most part. And also, as I think I said in the series, I hadn't realized that the quests, even in the campaign, were randomized as well, right? So there wasn't even necessarily a discrete sort of required ordering of the quests. And in fact, you could not do Leoric's quest and not know who the heck they're talking about by the end of the game if you hadn't. So that wasn't a high priority thing for them, obviously. And Diablo 3 basically takes that same concept of just going on these dungeon runs over and over and over again. And now to the degree where they're linking different tile sets together from load to load that have no sense to why they would be linked together. And it doesn't matter. It's like, well, I'm in adventure mode. They've defined a thing. And so you know what you're getting yourself into. You can still go back and play the campaign if you want to, which I do want to talk about a little bit in a second. Even though we didn't play that today. And
well, we both have, though.
So. We both have, yeah. But it just is taking that similar feeling, dungeon run sort of rhythm from the first game, in a way that was really when you boil it down, that was really what people kept playing. And to some degree, Diablo 1 was a little bit of that endless game for its time as well, because it was just that, one more click, and you're just going and trying to get all of those, those loot drops, which had a finite number, in that game, but in its time was amazing for that. And actually, the chat I noticed in the stream, they were talking about Borderlands 3 announcement and stuff, which is another modern version that we talked about in the series of Diablo's influence on the industry overall.
Yeah.
So yeah, but
and going whole hog on that procedural stuff and finding ways also. I mean, another thing that I think, this is something you kind of keyed in with the adventure mode, is you're finding a way to reuse very good assets that you might just sort of blaze through and go on to the next thing and sort of just forget about. And in fact, there were a couple places where you're like, I don't know if I've ever seen this tile set before. And it's like, well, I'm pretty sure this was in the main game. And you just forgot because you do go right past it, right? We talked about this. I think this has come up on the cast and maybe just on the stream, but at another time, is that on Republic Commando we made these hero rooms, which were like, it's going to be all about the art and it's just going to be amazing. We're going to really push the Unreal Engine on these one room, and there won't be a lot of combat in there. And those rooms were completely useless. They were gorgeous and they looked amazing, and then nobody noticed that they looked amazing because there's nothing to do. So the point being, they weren't memorable because you just went through them so quickly. and the fact that we spent extra to make them, or art really, more art time, to make just those rooms, meant that those rooms were meaningless, right? And so there's a certain sense in which in Diablo, because you're always questing after the loot or what have you, the tile sets themselves kind of fade into the background, and it's only on repeated viewing that you kind of like, oh yeah, okay, I remember this location.
They have such a variety.
Yeah.
They can mix and match them. Yeah, it's true. Yeah, and I mean, Diablo 3's kind of been reinventing itself from the beginning, and in I think I would say easily throughout its lifespan as a game, the whole concept of games as service has really morphed over time as well. And you could say they're one of the ones during this whole phase, whatever you want to say, last 5 to even 8 to 10 years. They're one of the ones that have been trying out stuff like this, right? And they don't, again, as I said, they don't necessarily have the same business models as some of these others. Kind of luckily, I'd say, but for the players, but this concept of taking these assets, like you said, and repurposing them in different ways. And as we talked about on the stream, I think, or maybe afterwards, the concept of encouraging and cross-pollinating all the systems from all the other classes. In and amongst themselves. So when you, because typically most players, they'll pick one class that they really like and they'll stick to it for the most part. But the seasonal system and the adventure mode system, everything seems to be pretty shared between all of your characters. And so it really encourages you to bounce around and play all of the other classes. So not only are they repurposing assets and monsters and animations and levels, but they're repurposing these classes that people may not normally play, and rewarding you for doing so with the seasonal sort of structure, which is basically, a time real world time-based set of quests that you need to do to get special armor sets and things like that. So they've really kind of, milked it for a lot of hours for people that are still pretty obsessed. And as somebody who is a self-proclaimed WoW player, and I play WoW in the same way, but that's a whole different, there's similarities. They definitely share things between each other, because in WoW, you're also running the same dungeon over and over again, but they don't have procedural levels there. And so you're running the same dungeons, and they might mix up the enemy attributes sometimes, like they're starting to do that more and more. But that's an example of where Diablo is influencing WoW. And vice versa, with the bosses in Diablo are very much like raid bosses in WoW. So it's very interesting to see a company, how those designs are sort of not only influencing others outside of in the industry, but also within their own company.
Yeah, so. No, it's interesting. There's kind of a couple of different spectra at play here, and I mean, one is the sort of the business model. I would say you've got WoW versus a Guild Wars kind of model. And you see this, Diablo 3 is really more on the Guild Wars model. I mean, you buy a product and it's yours to play online, does forever. And they're supporting it with incremental updates and things like that and such like. But fundamentally, that's very similar to Guild Wars 2. But it's very much Diablo in the sense of the procedurality, which Guild Wars is definitely not. So it's really interesting. It's a major advantage. It allows them to actually be able to support this game without asking you to buy anything else a lot more easily. And this game also, when it launched, you mentioned how it kind of has been updated since. A big part of the problem when it launched was that it tried to be too much WoW, or it pulled in the wrong things from WoW, maybe for the type of game that it was meant to be, especially with the inclusion of that original auction house, real money trading business. Because they were trying to find a way to make it pay for continue to pay for itself, or what have you.
Well, and there was, if you may recall, there was a, excuse me, in Diablo II, there was a big sort of gray market for, auctioning items outside of the game, right? That people ended up starting to actually make real money about.
We have eBay. A letter this week about that.
Oh, really? Okay,
we
good.
do. Yeah.
So So they, you can see some of the design logic for putting in an auction house in there and kind of trying to get a piece of that pie, but it's a little bit tricky to add that kind of stuff in after there's already a cultural sort of understanding about how a game works, so it ended up really just kind of pissing everybody off a little bit, like adding in paid mods after a game has been very heavily mod friendly.
Right,
I won't name any names, but
can't imagine who that would be.
I can't imagine either. So
also a generous game.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. But they were trying something different with that, and I actually just recently started playing a little bit of Guild Wars 2 with Reed, and they do still have the model that they've always had, where you're just paying for the base games or what have you, the expansion packs really at this point for Guild Wars 2 because it's free to start the game. But they did add in, apparently, I haven't fully figured it all out, but they did add in purchasable cosmetics, which something that Diablo 3 still hasn't done, which is fascinating to me because they do have transmogrification that they've taken from WoW. So they could do that, but they've chosen not to. So I'm sure they're working on Diablo 4 anyway. So
sure, yeah. No, and that's interesting. I mean, I think that there's a lot of open questions there. I mean, this is a game. Diablo 3 is apparently the third best-selling PC game of all time. So it's done quite well, and I would honestly say you can afford to be generous, and therefore you should be. Totally. I definitely am a huge believer that if you're successful with your game, you should do everything you can to just say, you know what, thank you, and we can afford to support it in these ways. I mean, that's definitely not a business decision I make, but just a sort of moral decision. And I know that large corporations don't often think that way.
Yeah, it's
it is tricky, and it's there's a lot to unpack about sort of the business of games, and that's not that's not what we're really about discussing here. But it's just like I do at the same time feel like if a game's going to come out and be that kind of successful, it is frustrating at that point to feel nickeled and dimed later. And I think honestly, it's that's also a lesson to publishers who come out and nickel and dime out of the gate. Is like, well, what are you doing? Like, you're saying when you come out, I don't think we can do big numbers, so we need to find some other way to bring tons of money in. And that's a vicious negative cycle, right? It's a vicious cycle. Whereas the other one, I think, is a virtuous cycle. I mean, we're talking about Diablo 4 as if it's immediately on the horizon. It hasn't even been announced, but there's so much goodwill towards Diablo, that we can't imagine that it wouldn't. And so we, and I think they've sort of tried to say without saying it's coming out, so that I think there is kind of a story there as well. But I do think that that is the flip side. That's a virtuous cycle. Is Diablo has always been a generous game design, with its procedural loot systems and its procedural dungeon generation, and even its, of course, procedural enemies, et cetera, that there was always just more to find, even in the sort of original game. And now that they're extending that even further and finding different ways to tie all this content that they have together, and reuse it in interesting ways, and just make the level treadmill as long as you want it to be. There's just a huge amount of generosity there, and that's going to make it. That's why people are really excited for a Diablo 4. And so it's self-fulfilling that Diablo 4 would sell a ton when it came out. If it were to come out next week, it would be bought in droves. And
I think, as we talked about with the series, as one of its key pillars and takeaways, the procedural design of it is the crux of the giving them the ability to be, as you said, be that generous, right? To allow them to repurpose stuff, and it's ingrained in the design. To compare it with something like a WoW, right? They're limited by the amount of content and levels that they make, so they have to find they have to find clever ways to repurpose that same content, but it doesn't ultimately, change that much for players. So it does people burn out on it, and other, I would say, the shooter looters and those sorts of games out there, which I guess the new term is schlooters, which I have a really hard time saying. A lot of those
I'm happy to mock you for saying it if you want.
Yeah, I can't. I'm not going to say it again. But those games often have discrete content as well, right? Where they're levels that you're running over and over again, and they're very expensive to make, and repurposing that stuff or doing new stuff is very cost ineffective. And so Diablo has always had it in its kind of DNA to be able to be this repurposing, which is a really great boon. And I think that's, I don't know this to be the case, but I'll just throw out a random theory on this. But a lot of indie games are moving into the roguelike area, because I think the procedural aspect is a much more efficient way to allow a small team to make a cool thing, because they have a lot more knobs to tune there, where they can make these component modular pieces and then repurpose them in cool ways. I have been playing Dead Cells off and on a little bit as an example, right? Which is a really stellar game, and it's kind of a roguelike hybrid. But a small team, and they did a lot with it. And it's different kind of every time you play through and stuff. So I'm sure that's a motivation for some small teams, to kind of leverage that Diablo mentality.
Yeah, no, it absolutely is. And Jason Schreier and Maddie Myers on Kotaku Waypoint interviewed the developers behind Into the Breach and FTL.
And those are good examples.
Yeah, they talked especially of, well, that's a way for us to leverage. I mean, they're two guys. that's it.
They have to do it that way.
They have to. They absolutely have to. If it's not going to take them years and years and years to make. I can remember back in the day, Andrew Kermsey talking about Meridian 59, and he and his brother and the team or whatever would make a ton of new content, or at least what they thought was a ton of new content, and they'd launch it, and 24 hours later it was all completed by somebody. And they'd be like, where's more? And it's really hard to if you don't build in systems rather than you sort of content generation, hand making your individual content as your system. It's very hard to keep up with sort of the demands of your sort of hardcore players and therefore greatest evangelists. So yeah, I mean, you see the reach of that kind of everywhere. So as we talk through the whole series, it is hugely influential for that reason. And stands on the shoulders of text-based giants in the field. So
and I think the funny thing, I probably should do some thinking about where the lineage for this is, but even talking about three's influence on things, the adventure mode is something they added in after launch, and as a structure for repurposing content, it has been emulated even in other places around the industry. And I don't know if they were the first really to do it. I mean, they're kind of stealing a little bit from WoW in some cases, but this sort of dynamic bounty sort of structure that adventure mode brings into the game. Bounties are in Destiny as well, as an example. And so even Diablo 3, even though it's the latest one, has having some influences here and there on that sort of procedural quest generation. But
I mean, it reminds me too of sort of procedural board game sort of generations of worlds as well, right? So I think it has a pretty long lineage. It's a pretty obvious way of like, if you know how these things are going to fit together. I mean, it's really how they did it. They're taking the way they fit together the tiles in Diablo 1 and extending it to, but what if we just hooked up all the levels this way? What if we just reached into the bag and pulled out some other level? Load times are a lot faster now, than they used to be. Let's just go ahead and do that, right? Let's just grab another thing. And you know what? The structure of a quest is always just go in and kill 98% of the enemies, and then this thing will spawn, and that'll be some special thing that's hard, and like whatever. I mean, you just see how that tumbles out, right?
Yep. Yeah. I was going to segue a little bit to the campaign just to mention it.
Sure.
Because I did restart it, even though I've mainly been playing seasonal adventure mode. I did restart it, and I know you played it, and this would be my second time through. I played on PC when it came out. The thing that, from talking about from the standpoint of 1, and then talking about 3, the 3 sort of quick takeaways that I'll throw out there for Diablo 3's campaign that I really enjoyed. One that Brett won't care that much about, from a lore and story perspective, they did some fun things. You probably don't remember, or didn't even remember the minute after you finished it the first time, but you return to some of the old ruins of Tristram,
Yes.
and some of the previous characters from the first one that were established in the first one return. Adria and some of the lore from that they developed a little bit in 2, and so I really appreciated how much they sort of, because there was a pretty big gap between 2 and 3, and so there was a lot of nostalgia, and I thought clever ways that they brought in some of those characters. Deckard Cain's niece, I think, is her name. I mean, not her name, but I think that's her relationship. Adopted niece, maybe.
Yeah.
And so you have all these cool connections. And actually, I think she's the daughter of Adria. Anyway, it doesn't matter. But they did it was starting off that game, and kind of you start in New Tristram, and then you go to some of the ruins that you remember from the first game. And that was just a neat way to bring fans of the previous games back in. The other quick one...
It's like having Kylo Ren be the son of 2 of your beloved characters, right? To bring it to a new generation, right? I mean, it'd been a while since there'd been new. Sorry, the interstitial tissue there wasn't quite established as I started to say it, but no, I mean, you're establishing a new character who's tied into the old ways, into the old story somehow. Yeah.
Well, and that you're gonna, in Kylo's case, you're immediately, if you're a fan, you're immediately connected to that character,
right,
because of his parents, and then the events that happen in the movie that I won't spoil hopefully make it even more impactful for you.
Yeah.
Because
and if you're not, I mean, the real issue, the real risk for a creator is you have to make them make sense and stand on their own as well. They have to be right. You have to do the work in the new thing that you're making to actually establish that character or whatever as being important and interesting in their own right. So
no, that's a really good point. Yep, that's something that definitely people underestimate. Take it from me. Anyway, so the other 2 quick ones, we talked about this on the stream maybe a little bit. I really appreciate moving to 3D, even though one might say, it's always been a 2D centric game, and so why did they have to do that, or why was it necessary? Probably wasn't necessary, but I think that it brought a lot of extra fun things to the game that the other ones didn't have. Things like filling out and making the spaces feel a lot larger than life and bigger. And so they could have done that in 2D, but it's much easier and simpler to do that when you have 3-dimensional spaces and cameras that you can control in a very explicit way. Physics are very cool in the game. They have a lot of fun with that. Effects and animation and the dynamism of the whole game is just much different than a 2D game would have been able to do. Definitely possible in 2D, but there's just something cool about the different ways that all the enemies die, and the way that all of your skill and spell effects happen. The lighting's great, so I think the move to 3D was a cool direction in my opinion.
It scales better for them, right. I think, in that
much easier to port.
It's much easier to port. There's a lot of reasons. It's also just when you're doing something that's 2D, there's just the cost of images and to build those images, and of course you have to make the 3D models and all that stuff. as well. So it's certainly not free, but there's a lot of share, a lot of opportunity for shared data, animations and things like that. I mean, granted, they probably animate every individual creature differently, so maybe they don't get any benefit of that, but you can imagine it, maybe for a smaller team doing that. So
Yeah. Well, I mean, effects are a good example of shared, right? Like if you have a lightning effect, you can repurpose that stuff. You've made one instance of an effect that is instanced around for any character with lightning attacks or any enemy.
Right.
And so it doesn't, hypothetically, it wouldn't matter which enemy had it. They could just add it to it, right? So you can do some of that in 2D as well, but there's still some extra. Yeah, there's a lot of efficiencies there. I just think it's a very beautiful game, and it still feels like Diablo to me, but I think it feels more dramatic in a 3-dimensional space in so many ways.
Yeah. No, I totally agree.
The last mini one, and then we can maybe conclude, for me is, I was thinking about this before we started playing today, and I guess the way that I would summarize it is, and then ironically, this notion's coming to me because I played a sorcerer in Diablo 1 when we played for the series, and I hadn't played that before. So the dynamic of swapping spells as that character in Diablo 1 and kind of micromanaging that aspect was something that I didn't really ever have with the rogue, which I had played originally. You're just kind of firing arrows and changing up some stuff, but I was a lot more thoughtful and a little bit more strategic, or tactical rather, with the sorcerer because I had to be. And the interesting thing about the few classes that I've played, haven't played everything in Diablo 3, but really what I feel like they've done is they've really made every character have spells, is the way that I would say it.
Yeah.
And yes, it might be in the form of a shield bash or some of the skills that the demon hunter get are just hilarious at how over the top they are, and they're essentially like the fireball or the electrical, I forget the name of the electrical one,
chain lightning or whatever.
Well, the lightning one that charge bolt, the one that
bolt.
Sure. Kind of. So they have these. The sorcerer in Diablo 1 had a lot of these kind of crazy, cool, over the top spells. And really in Diablo 3, every character has that. The skills and abilities are just larger than life, over the top, just crazy, fun, bombastic abilities that have a bunch of different damage types, and you can spec yourself in all different ways. And you get basically some sort of ability or skill pretty much every level, almost every level until 70. And so there's always something to kind of fiddle with, but it's not like as a demon hunter or even a crusader, which I played on the stream, I still felt like a spellcaster in a way because I had all these different, these different things happening, that it wasn't just me swinging a sword. So they really leaned into that, and each one feels really unique. I've heard that the Necromancer is a whole nother ball game, which I'd love to try at some point because of all the minions. But anyway, it's fascinating progression for these games.
No, it's a series that I love, and it's funny because I played it co-op, Diablo 3. I mean, I almost feel like it. In some ways, it was just a thing I was doing with my son. And so a lot of what was going on in the game, I kind of just lost track of. And so I almost want to go back and play through the campaign again as a solo player, just so I can actually feel like I experienced that. Because to a certain degree, I feel like I didn't. Just because
I'd recommend it.
Yeah, it was more just, I'm just spending time, with my son, and it was not really, about, what I was seeing on the screen or what have you. So it's, we were blazing by, we were going at his pace, right? We were blazing by everything. And, cause he doesn't have any connection with Diablo. So there's that too.
Yeah. I mean, your couch co-op is about the couch more than anything else. It's fun playing. It kind of reminds me, I don't think we've talked about it much on the podcast, but, what was that Baldur's Gate Dark Alliance.
Dark Alliance, yeah. I think it's come up once or twice, but yeah, we don't talk about it often. Yeah.
But I mean, that I can imagine, though I haven't played Diablo on couch co-op, I can imagine kind of a similar feel to that. Which was just loads of fun.
No, I mean, whenever I play couch co-op games with Andrew in particular, the stories of the games, whatever's going on in the story, we have no idea. No, it's just, unless the game is very, very, I mean, the exception I would say is last year's A Way Out that we played couch co-op. But that's a much different, very targeted, every mechanic is specific sort of game, instead of one of these sort of systemic games. And so that made I think that made a big difference in how we perceived it and played through it. And there wasn't the ability to skip things and whatever. Yeah. So often we would play something else. It'd be, oh yeah, blah, 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 cutscene, et cetera, et cetera. What's our objective? I don't really care about anything other than what are we supposed to do now? Because time that we weren't doing the thing together was time we were just sitting watching. We could have just watched a movie, right? So it was, I think that's part of it, is you just like, oh, let's just skip this. Who cares? Because of the couch. Like you put it well. It's about the couch. Okay. All right. So let's, I guess we'll say goodbye to Diablo now.
Yep. See you later. See you again. See you in the rifts, Diablo.
Oh
man, yeah, I'm in a bad shape with as the podcast knows. I'm a huge fan of portable gaming and handheld gaming, and so I was saying on the stream, I just am flabbergasted that I'm playing this kind of fully fleshed out Diablo RPG kind of game on the Switch in my hands, on the couch or on the ferry, wherever I am, and it's just it's got me hooked. So well, I'm not going to be stopping anytime soon.
Well, that's good. I mean, if you weren't traveling this week, I'd be like, well, the Red Sox are on the West Coast. I'll be staying up late anyway. But you're going to be traveling.
Well, I mean, we will be in a house, so with internet, so maybe we can work.
That could happen then. Yeah. It's like 11:30 at my time, and Tim's like, I could play for an hour. I'd be like, well, I don't know, there's still another few innings to go. We could.
All right, I'll ping you.
Yeah, keep it in mind. Okay, let's. We have been building up over the last few weeks. We've had longer episodes. We had our bonus episode that we didn't even talk about it yet. Our long interview last week with Dave Brevik. Oh man, great interview. And yes, I kind of fanboyed out there at the end.
Yeah. I wasn't going to say anything, but you went pretty hardcore on that one.
Yeah, I definitely did.
I loved hearing.
Yeah, no, it was. Part of it is I only sort of had a sense of who he was recently, right? I mean, looking into Diablo and things like that. When I first played Diablo, it was like I didn't really know. Who made this game, right? And because I wasn't even in the industry yet, I had barely a sense that people made games, right? And it was only recently that I had the appreciation of just like how involved that was, especially at that time, and all this sort of, some of the things that he was doing and learning, making his first game in C or whatever. I mean, just like some of the things that I just go and like am just overwhelmed by. So there part of it was that, but also just a lot of stuff just rushing back over 20 years of just like, oh yeah, I remember, when I was in it, like you're in it now again with Diablo 3. So, but
and he seemed like a good guy too, and he'd gone through similar, seems like similar stories to what you had gone through.
Yeah. In terms of when we grew up and
So, and I forgot to mention it though, but shout out to Anthony Gallegos who's the connection to getting him on the podcast. Anthony worked for him on Marvel Heroes.
Oh, cool! I was wondering what the connection was there. Oh,
yeah, that's how I got connected with Dave to get on the podcast. So thanks to Anthony for that, who of Rebel FM and such.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, well let's turn then to well, we got a couple of reviews first. I was going to say to emails, but we have two reviews. You've got one, I've got one. Why don't you go ahead with yours?
Okay, subject, love this podcast from Lame Star Games.
If that is your real name.
That's definitely his real name, her real name, their real name.
Lamistar. It's not Lamestar, it's Lamistar.
A Lamistar. Okay, well done. The two battle-worn video game industry veterans play some of the most influential games in a book club-like fashion. Their insight into the tools and techniques that make these games provide this cast with a plethora of information that is unique and relevant. Keep up the great work. Hang
loose. It's a shaka. You don't know that? You don't know what a shaka is. No. You grew up on the West Coast. I was even further from Hawaii, and I know what that is.
Yeah, but that's just a myth. I don't know just because I grew up near the Sierras.
Well, that's true. Fair enough. But I grew up, anyway, I had some surfer in me when I was in high school. So
hang loose.
/ shaka symbol. Yeah.
All right.
So
how about you?
I've got 10-10-10 from Journeyman 2011.
Whoa.
Of the New Jersey 2011s. A glorious, fascinating, can't-miss voyage in weekly installments through the halcyon, sometimes quixotic history of video games, an artistic medium that elevates, inspires, and connects us with human and extra-human experiences like none other. Thanks, Brett and Tim, for the invaluable gifts of thankfully critical nostalgia and visions that the future of gaming may be quite bright. So thank you.
Wow, 2 great reviews. That's
very kind.
Thank you.
Yeah, we love to have those. They help us reach out to new listeners, people who might not be aware of the podcast. Those reviews really help, kind of put that in people's faces. Oh, hey, here's something you might like. You like games? Here's another good games podcast. So we appreciate each and every review. Thank you to Lame Star Games and Journeyman 2011 for those. And of course, if you put in lyrics that are pastiche. All right, I don't need to go there.
You can. I mean, it's your funeral. I just sit here and listen and am entertained, so I don't mind. Make sure you pick a song that Brett might know, and
you have to put what the song is at the end of the review. Yeah,
although it is hilarious to see if you can guess too. I might throw that out as an extra challenge.
Right, great, thanks. At that point, you have to do your own impression of the song. I think it's this. Yeah, put the song in.
I retract it.
I thought you might. Anyway, those go through the Apple podcast infrastructure, and they really do help. So thanks so much for those. These next emails, which have been starting to pile up, go to devgameclub@gmail.com. Go ahead, Tim, with the first one.
Subject, Diablo Thoughts Redux. Raymond Kaysen.
Yeah, sure. Kaysen, probably, I'm guessing.
Kaysen, yeah, okay, Raymond. Hi, in honor of GOG.com getting Diablo 1 and somehow with high-res support, I've played Diablo 1 for the first time in a while. So some fresh Diablo thoughts. The first one, man, the movement speed bothers me in this game, especially since there's no way to increase it. I forgot gold takes up inventory spaces, and not only that, it's capped at 5,000 per space. I remember just having a gold farm in town where I dropped my gold, since drop items persist when you save load. And then the last one, started playing a rogue, and I completely forgot rogues can disarm traps. Probably since it's a pretty useless skill of all things considered. I haven't come across a trap yet. Just saw the skill in the quick menu. Regards, Raymond. The gold, specifically the gold, was one that I had forgotten about too.
Yeah.
And then I was like, wait a second, what's happening here? Oh no.
Yeah, the gold. So the gold thing is wild, because I think about that in the context of a multiplayer game.
Oh yeah, totally.
And how you don't have town to just drop your. If you drop your stuff, somebody else will take it. So you have to carry that everywhere with you, and it's funny because that adds that adds a friction to the game in multiplayer that's probably frustrating. It's because you have fewer inventory slots now, especially as you've played longer, and you end up having to go back to town more frequently to sell the things. I mean, just like that whole loop that we talked about, I think, especially in the last episode, of having the ups and downs, and having to go back to town and all those kind of loops, that's not really conducive to multiplayer where you want to like try to stick together and do more and more and more as much as you can. I mean, tonight we went back to town, but I didn't need to. I could have just kept going. I mean, I know there are limits, but the limits are pretty high.
Generous,
yeah, they're very generous. And I remember playing co-op with my son that we really didn't have to do that. It was more that we did that so we could get money to do something else we were pursuing. I guess like the artisan stuff probably takes money and things like that. I don't remember the sort of ways they take money out of the system, but
the artisan, the way you upgrade your artisans is spending money.
Okay, yeah. So you had to go and do. There was an economy that required that at some point where you wanted to do that, but in the original Diablo, of course, they didn't really have that, and the inventory space was at a premium. And in multiplayer, especially on the wilds of the internet, you didn't want to just go and drop your money in town. So interesting.
The interesting thing that I don't think I mentioned in the series that I did think about with gold being in your inventory and capped at 5,000. I don't know about you. We've probably talked about this in some of the other RPGs we played, but I tend to hoard my gold in pretty much every game I play.
Yep.
And so by the end of a game, I tend to have way more than I need, especially if in a game like Diablo 1 where you can play for a long, long time and become sort of uber powerful, and money tends to ultimately become not as useful for you. But when you space cap it like that with your inventory, which if you consider each of those inventory slots as basically a high value, part of the system, so each one's really worth a lot to you, especially as you're adventuring around. What it basically does is it forces / encourages you to spend money.
Yeah.
Even when you may not need to.
Yeah.
Especially in end game, where, and again, like I said, money tends to not be that valuable. So if you're playing co-op with a lot of people who are pretty high level and have been doing it for a while, none of you really need anything. So, but you are running out of space because you really would get a lot of money.
Yeah, you'd end up with 20 slots full of 5K each.
Yeah,
easily.
You're like, well, I don't need this. I'm just gonna go buy stuff, you know. And
that's when you would go to the store and be like, well, let me just buy the most expensive thing and sell it back, so I could see if something else cool would be in that spot that I might want. Yeah.
It's such a funny thing.
Yeah. It is. So, it's a weird thing with some friction and what's a later emailer calls grit, and so we'll talk to that point later. But it is kind of a weird thing, and it's a weird hitch in the smoothness of this engine. So the gameplay engine, for sure. As far as the rogues and the skill for traps, it is weird in that I feel like they wanted to have a thing that was unique to rogues, and I'm not sure that was successful because the traps are random. You could very conceivably go through a whole instance of Diablo and not see a single trap. And also, you're so accustomed to just go click on everything that you probably have clicked on the chest that has the trap on it, and the trap has been sprung by the time you've actually realized, oh shoot, there was a trap there, I could use my skill. Which happened to me any number of times. It is sadly a fairly useless skill. That said, not having a skill is not really a big deal. So,
yeah, it's a mechanic that's in conflict with the game, I think, because it's such a fast-paced game and action-oriented game and click fest that, it's just not only that, but I think actually for me, one of the bigger contributing factors to its uselessness is that traps are not actually that lethal. Mm-hmm. So, you're not really taught to look out for traps because either they miss you half the time or when they hit you, they don't do that much damage.
Yeah.
So you're not really incentivized to really worry about traps.
And they really can't, right? Because 2 out of 3 characters can't deal with them. So
Yep.
yeah,
It
so
was
it's
probably a tune down and down and down.
I
Your
bet,
traps.
yeah. I bet
So,
the QA response to more deadly traps was, "This is not fair. I need to open
yeah.
this chest to see if there's some health inside, and I get whacked, and it's
Yeah. Or they would have just given the skill to everybody if they wanted to keep lethal traps.
right, which would have just slowed down the game. So it is just a weird. There's a weird conflict there, and well worth pointing out, Raymond. All right, I've got one here from Derek Achoy. It says, subject, bosses in Diablo and Diablo likes. Hi, Tim and Brett. I was wondering what your thoughts are on boss design in the Diablo series and other games like Diablo. Personally, I have very mixed feelings. On the one hand, I love the spectacle of a unique, horrifying enemy who is ultra-powerful. I also love the promise of a big loot drop once it's defeated. On the other hand, I'm not sure the combat in these games is the best fit for duels with a single giant monster. My boss battles tend to involve a lot of running, dying, and slowly chipping away at a massive health bar. They're more fun in multiplayer, but solo it quickly starts to feel like a chore to me. What do you guys think? Thanks as always for the awesome show. Derek, aka Speaky Clean, which I think is his real name. P.S. Any chance of you guys playing Shenmue this year with Shenmue 3 slated for release? On the PS, I mean, there's always a chance. There's always at least two chances, slim and none. No, I don't actually. We haven't even talked about Shenmue. So maybe.
Interesting.
It is interesting to think about.
I've never played it.
I haven't either. So that would be a blind spot for us.
I don't think I'm going to get a Dreamcast for it, though. I'll tell you that. But I should. But
oh, wow. But I should. Wow. The console collector is just struggling. It's struggling to get out.
This podcast is the fault. I wasn't collecting consoles before.
Yes, you were.
Well, in certain ways I was, but now
Nintendo
it's like
consoles in particular.
Yeah, well, handhelds is what my we digress, but yeah. So on the bosses, I completely. What was his name again?
Derek.
I completely agree with Derek.
Yeah.
Yep. It's definitely a weakness, and I think we probably talked about this on the series, but for the most part, I think it comes. We talk so much about sort of the simplification of RPGs and the actionification of them for Diablo 1, and they obviously keep that going throughout the series. And when you do that, basically it means that a lot of, with this kind of merging this top-down RPG with an action-oriented framework, you're going to kind of simplify your mechanics down to easy-to-use things. And once you start doing that with this sort of format, you're just not going to be able to have a lot of predictable ways to make boss battles interesting, especially when you have such a diverse set of classes and such a diverse set of skills. And so they kind of end up having to probably water them down a bit in what you can do. I do think that Diablo 3 is doing obviously the best job, because they've kind of made them a little bit like WoW raid bosses, where there's patterns but ultimately they're basically just, damage sponges. And if you're moving around, it's probably because they've done something to the level. So at least they've made the level a little bit more of a part of the boss battle, which is a good thing. And almost all of them have minions as well.
Yeah.
To his point.
Yeah.
Not fun to fight one-on-one in these games for the most part. So the minions help distract you. But
I think the most successful one, and you could go, check the stream if you're watching this, in 30 days after it came out, in the 30 days after it came out. But the one boss we fought that jumped around and dropped stuff from the ceiling and things like that, I thought was the most successful of the Diablo 3 ones we played.
The guy with the flamethrower?
Yes, the guy with the flamethrower. Yeah. That I thought was the most interesting, because there were a number of mechanics at play that were going on, and it didn't feel. It felt like I had to pay attention to the environment and what he was going to do a lot more than anything else we fought. And of course, none of that is in the original Diablo. There's a number of things I could have imagined them doing, such as having, since those were quests, having something which were, sort of lock and key gadgets,
Mhm.
basically. Something that you could throw down, like, oh, you're going to fight
A
the
little bit of
butcher.
puzzly.
You've got to throw down some pentagram thing that you got to then lure him into, and then maybe that gives you a buff for him, a debuff for long enough that maybe you can, even the scales. I mean, to kind of have a one-off thing that it can do. But one-offs versus this very systemic sort of game don't really mix well.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I wouldn't be surprised if, because in the levels themselves, in the level design, and actually they have rewards and incentives in place for this. They have a lot of traps, springable traps.
Mm-hmm.
When it comes to like, you can trigger a wall to fall on things,
Right,
or like,
right.
cut the chain and have a chandelier fall on things, and you get like bonus points for that and stuff. So I wouldn't be surprised if they had dabbled in some experiments with boss design to incorporate traps, because it's pretty much everywhere else in the game.
Yeah.
However, to your point, those are one-offs, and so you'd have to replenish them or something like that. And so that would be an area they could delve into. But they really just come down to kind of just spectacle for the most part.
Yeah. Yeah.
The one exception that I think is the case, but I haven't played this way yet, that probably some hardcore Diablo 3 players are yelling at their listening devices at us about, is in the higher level difficulties, like up in Torment and stuff. I think the bosses do get very, very difficult, and you have to come in with the right spec, and you have to do things in certain ways, because it's just so darn hard.
Goes much more
you,
raidy, much more even Monster Hunter-y, maybe.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah.
Like Mythics in WoW, Mythic runs in WoW, where it's just so difficult, you can't. There's no margin for error.
I see.
So
yeah.
I think it does change in higher difficulties, but I haven't played that way. So.
I mean, that's true of a lot of games, though. So I mean, you get higher difficulties.
Yeah,
like you really
Kingdom
just have
Hearts.
to execute on the thing. Well, JRPG is maybe not the best example, because you can always just grind and level. As a person who did 25 or 30 levels just on the opening island where you can't die, I can say in Kingdom Hearts that it's possible to grind around some of the difficulty issues. So
that's right. Oh yeah, you're a madman.
I am. I'm insane. I'm a very. It's my heart. My heart. I'm just getting in touch with my heart. Let's just move on.
Yeah, please. No more heart puns. Okay.
Don't be a nobody.
Oh boy. Okay, ready?
Yes, I'm ready.
Okay, next one. Subject Diablo from Sean Richards. Hi, DGC. Enjoy the podcast and deconstruction of gaming history. I played a fair bit of Diablo in its early days. The beta was one of those PC game magazines. Griswold had a much harsher "what do you want" greeting. You could only do the first few cathedral levels. It was dark, scary, perfect for 11-year-old me. My friend bought it on release, and we played the heck out of it. One of us controlling the mouse, the other spamming motions when required. That's co-op.
Yeah, that reminds me of like Super Mario Galaxy co-op, where the Super Mario Galaxy, for those who haven't played, there's one person who does the game, the Mario stuff, and the other person can point the Wii controller at the screen and pick up the drops, the little, I forget what they're called in Super Mario Galaxy, but they're the gems or whatever that are dropping all over the place. That person can like click and automatically pick them up. Basically, you can be Tim's chicken in Diablo 3.
Cuckoo.
Cuckoo. Excuse me. Anyway, continue.
Let's see. Regards to the left click does all commands, this was in the days when Blizzard titles were dual Win-Mac on the disc. Maybe that was part of the design decision. Oh, that's a very interesting point.
Yeah, that's an interesting thought. The single button mouse that the Macintosh had at the time. I haven't had a Mac in a while. I think they have two buttons now. But that was an interesting one that I hadn't considered. I'm not sure, because they're very PC centric in development, but I don't know. They are, but also Blizzard was always very good about having. They've always been that way. Yeah, for sure. I mean, and Bungie was too. Actually, Bungie was actually started mostly on Mac.
Primary Mac. Yeah. He continues. They also had the spawn install feature, so you could play multiplayer by sharing from a full install as a host. We played plenty of StarCraft Diablo on the dial-up this way. Local calls, of course, as internet was $2.50 per hour those days. So BattleNet was seldom used and usually full of hackers. I forgot about the spawn thing, but that's what we did too. That's a really good point. And that's why it was so easy to play at work.
And
true.
And
since you might go into Diablo 2 in the future follow-up, the above friend ended up leaving high school to be a D2 gold farmer selling rare items on the internet for real money.
Yep.
Which touches on a post-future follow-up to Diablo 3's auction house to circumvent said gold trading, which created a pay-to-win economy until they shut it down. Anyway, thanks for sharing your experiences, Sean. Holy cow, left high school?
Yeah, wow.
Oh, man. Games.
What are we doing? What are we doing to our nation's youth, Tim?
I know. Well, WoW did some of that too.
It sure did. Blizzard has a lot to answer for.
yeah, for addiction, basically.
Yeah.
And gold farming. Yeah, and WoW ended up implementing a different sort of quote unquote solution to that ultimately.
What you mean the bind on pickup type thing, or
that, but also they have these tokens now that you can buy with real money that you can also sell in the auction house.
Oh, good God.
And they are connected to basically the economy of the game, so they go up and down based on how valuable they are with in-game gold. So essentially there's a way for anybody to if they farm gold, you can basically use that gold to buy these tokens, which allow you to have a free subscription if you play enough. So basically, people keep their gold so they can spend it to get free time to play.
Wow.
There's more to it than that, but that's kind of a quick summary. But
yeah, I mean, there's a couple things here. I mean, one is WoW. We touched on this in talking about Diablo III, about the auction house and the sort of gray market economy, as you put it, as far as that goes. The other thing that I hadn't thought about was playing StarCraft or Diablo on dial-up, which is not a thing I ever did. As it turns out, for Diablo, I had a local call into my university where I was a grad student, and then I could play on the internet for free, right? Because I was basically connected to the internet that way. I mean, still via a phone, but I had a gateway that took me to the internet that way. Mm-hmm. So it's funny to me. I hadn't thought about that in whatever 20 something years. That at the time, for most people, actually, that might have been a little bit more to do, because Prodigy and CompuServe and America Online was still pretty young even at that point, where all of those costs were actually pretty high, and per hour, per minute, whatever,
Oh yeah, they were.
Yeah, they were squeezing people, and I mean, for probably good reason, honestly, because there was no infrastructure to support any of this. All of that stuff had to start to be built at that time. And I mean, yeah, it's weird to think about. But these sorts of games came along at a time when ubiquitous access to the internet for, some number of dollars per month rather than per hour, is the norm, at least here in North America, is a big difference. And I hadn't considered that. So I appreciate that, because I was already in sort of a position of privilege as far as the internet goes, in 1997 or what have you.
Yeah. I mean, I was working at Lucas by then too. And so also a warped sense of reality because of the infrastructure we had right at work. Mm-hmm. So the concept of having a LAN was, most people didn't have that, other
Yeah.
than working in a corporation or something. So, but to your point about sort of the time, I don't think we've ever really talked about this on the podcast. There's not been maybe much of a reason to do it, but and I think you would agree with this. I feel like this is maybe even statistically true, that video games have often been the sort of motivating force for technology to be pushed forward, especially in video card land.
Oh, for sure.
Because
there are two drivers of technical innovation in the career science area: video games and, can you guess the other one, Tim? You can't. Pornography.
Okay, darn it. I was going to say pharmaceuticals for some reason, but that's not really the same.
That is not really the same. No. As far as being able to share stuff, yeah. Weird,
but
it is weird to be in that class with that, and that's no shaming. It's just weird to me.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it is what it is. But humans, huh?
Mm-hmm.
But
we have a lizard brain. It wants two different things, huh? Those are those.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But yeah, video card technology and GPU technology being and CPU, but on the internet side, broadbands, etc. That was definitely a driver as well, because people didn't want to spend $250 per hour.
Right. Yeah.
So you just DSLs and people trying to get T1s, which my dad actually worked for AT&T, so he he was always trying to get T1s to our house in the woods, which never actually happened, but a boy could dream.
Well, I mean, I wonder too about things like, so for me, playing some text adventures via 200 baud modem, those foam cup things, and tying up a phone line. There's DSL, but there was also, that was the local call first, but there was also like voicemail.
Yeah.
Right. That your phone's busy, so you get voice, you have a message machine that's there. You're right. I mean, just like, I think about all the sorts of things that I mean, that's not just obviously games, but most phone calls at that time. I mean, when my grandmother was in her 80s, I would talk to her on the phone, and she'd want to get off the phone in like 5 minutes or less, because phones were so expensive. No, it's just like her understanding of a phone call was very, very different from mine.
Yeah.
And the same thing with internet access has changed in the same way in the last 20 years. So for her, a phone call that was not a local phone call was ridiculously expensive, like luxuriously expensive. And the same thing with internet. If you came of age at a certain time, that connections to the internet were luxuriously expensive. And it's just interesting the way those things change. And I feel like a lot of that is, with the phone lines, being able to have a phone call that lasts 2 hours was a luxury 40 or 50 years ago, is nothing today. I mean, it's not even a thing. You don't even think about it. If you want to talk to somebody for 2 hours, talk to somebody for 2 hours. You never even consider it, any part of it. And the same goes with the internet. So yeah, it was interesting thinking about that. Getting this,
we're recording this podcast across the country for pennies.
for basically nothing. It's just part of my internet service and yours as well, I'm sure. I'm saying, yeah, that's wild.
So you got the next one?
I do, and I should have actually assigned this to you, but I'll take it so that I could respond to it, because I'm going to read it and then I'm going to respond. The subject is IK-ARM question from Zimmy Finger. His real name, I'm pretty sure.
Zimmy.
Yeah,
Love him.
yeah. Hey, a first-time writer for Tim, or frequent writer for Brett. Brett, I was hoping you could clarify the IK-ARM device. My understanding: first you create a real-life sculpture, then this device touches certain areas on the sculpture and uploads the coordinates to a computer. What was the reason for this device instead of, say, using software on the computer? P.S. Really enjoyed Tim's reactions to Brett's journey through Kingdom Hearts. I would be delighted to hear more. You heard some more today. PPS, have you considered doing short games? I'm thinking Out of This World by Eric Chahi or Portal. So let's take the first part of that and the third part of that. Yeah, so I looked this up after flubbing around and trying to remember what they were called. These were actually called digitizers, this device that I was talking about, where it was basically a robot-style arm where you could determine a point in space directly by the angles of these, the 2 or 3 joints or whatever on the object. The reason that you didn't do this with software on the computer was probably twofold. One is there were no skilled 3D modelers using computers. There were no people who knew how to do that. So that
didn't happen.
Yeah, I mean, that's a thing that came along later and was an interesting transition that was happening at the start of our careers at LucasArts. I mean, that sort of 5 or 10 year period. There were people who had been making 2D art who were trying to figure out how to make 3D art. And especially at LucasArts, where there was a huge, really skilled 2D art, employee base. I mean, people had made the art for all those adventure games and things like that. So that's one thing. The other point was the reason why you wouldn't use that, use software to do that was there were no 3D modeling programs. There were those that did exist were for computer-aided design, were mostly math-based and were also hugely slow. They were not interactive. So the way to actually make a 3D model with a digitizer, that was actually way faster and use skills that the that your potential employees actually had, because nobody had actually learned how to do 3D modeling with a computer. So a couple of different reasons why that was a thing at the time.
Yeah, I think it's so 3D modeling is so ubiquitous at this point. I think people, just assume it's been
around,
the whole
yeah,
time.
but it hasn't.
Interesting kind of little anecdote that relates to I don't know if you were on this Twitter thread, but I think you were with the LucasArts historian guy.
Yeah, from LucasArts.
Anyway, we were talking about
John or whatever. Yeah,
talking about John Knowles because he was on a recent podcast someplace where they interviewed him, and he's an interesting case because he's over at Turn 10 now working on the Forza Horizon games, but he's a great talented fellow, and he started in 2D at LucasArts, and he worked on Super Star Wars on the SNES and stuff like that, and very talented 2D artist. But then the cover of Dark Forces that we played, which is a 3-dimensional stormtrooper or two running at the sort of camera, I believe he built that in 3D. So that was sort of like the transition was starting to happen there, and you had these artists who were starting to sort of reinvent themselves, so to speak, and John was able to do that. He eventually became project lead at LucasArts on a few different things. And so it was an interesting time because especially LucasArts, which was, by the time that it closed, it was a 31-year-old studio. It had seen kind of every era of that kind of artistic work happen over its history.
Yeah, I mean, really, the only thing it hadn't really had was text adventures.
Right. Yeah.
In terms,
just started right after that.
Yeah, right after that had started, and it was in that sort of very, very early period where 2D was even 2D was very slow. And if you go back to our sort of Space Quest, King's Quest discussion with who do we interview for that?
That was Mark Crow, right?
Yes, Mark Crow. I was trying to remember his last name. You even talked to him about slowing down the rendering on the Apple II version of Space Quest and what that reveals about how they had to construct those worlds. They were trying to figure out how to make 2D. So wrap your head around that on a computer. Right. I mean, it's like why wouldn't you just do it on the computer? Computers were freaking slow, man. And the math is hard. And I mean, I wrote my first 3D renderer on a PC a little over 30 years ago now. And you didn't measure it in frames per second. you measured it in how long it would take to render a frame, which was sometimes longer than a minute. So depending on how complicated your model was. So it's,
man, you're old.
I am old, but also the amount that this stuff has changed in the last 30 years is just extraordinary.
I mean, we in our pockets we have a computer
that
is astounding compared to that stuff.
In my pocket, I have a computer that I could write an interpreted program that draws something around the complexity that took over a minute to render. I could probably program, a cube render or something like that on my phone in less time than it took to render the darn thing back in 1986 or whatever when I first wrote my first 3D renderer. So, yeah, it's insane. So, all right.
Next one.
Yes, this is a good one.
Subject.
This touches on our podcast.
Oh, okay.
In an interesting way.
Subject is, and suddenly I'm a game developer, in quotes, from Baked Potato. Definitely their real name.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
Dear Brett and Tim.
Probably from Idaho.
Jeez, you just don't know when to stop.
Wait, hold on a sec. You can stop?
Well, maybe this podcast will teach you something. Dear Brett and Tim, I'm a longtime listener and lifelong gaming hobbyist who has loved learning about the game development process. Game development has always seemed like a far-off dream, and your response to Jesse Morgan's letter, Getting into Game Dev Late, on episode 141, didn't do much to make that dream seem any more achievable. Strangely, though, I have achieved that.
So hold on. So on episode 141, we talked specifically about here's how to develop your skills for sort of the traditional game dev roles, just to, for people who don't want to rewind that far back.
I have no memory at all, so I wouldn't know what we said on that.
Yeah.
Strangely, though, I have achieved that dream! ! I'm a research psychologist who was a couple years out of graduate school when I started talking with a major gaming company about joining their user research team. 3 months later, I was hired on to do the work you described in your response to Aaron Evers' email in episode 124, player mechanics in games.
Player metrics.
Shockingly, player metrics in games. Shockingly, I didn't have to build out a profile, do pro bono work, or start out at the bottom. I just had some strong analysis skills that I had worked hard to develop, paired with a wealth of first-hand knowledge of games. I started working at this company around the start of the new year, and it's been a trip so far. I've taken on some fascinating methodological problems and have loved that. And I've also been present for some high-level strategic meetings I never thought I'd be part of. On the other hand, I've also seen sizable layoffs at my company. The games industry certainly is full of highs and lows. So yeah, I have a sense that other listeners will want to know, how did you do it? The truth is, I have no idea. The whole situation reminds me of the premise of the film Mark Wahlberg
film Invincible. Sorry, yeah, I should have edited this a little bit. Yeah,
no, it's okay. Invincible, where he's a 30-year-old bartender who gets drafted into the NFL to play football with his heroes. Yeah, totally. Good luck to anyone trying to make this happen, and maybe I'll run into Brett and Tim with a JR at the end at GDC. But you're Baked Potato.
Yeah.
Unless that is your real name, we won't know how to find you.
I actually had the actual person's name, but he wanted to edit it for privacy, so I let him do that.
No, that's fair. That's fair.
Yeah.
In this case, I think he should.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's amazing. I'm sure Brett has a response, but really quickly, it's really, I guess I'm not, it's really awesome and exciting that he's done it. The only thing that I will say I'm not too surprised on is that user research is a really growing need and form for video games. And because he had that great background and knowledge, I can see him being valuable, or her, or they being valuable to a company, without, necessarily coming from a previous game job, because there's a lot of game developers who have no idea how to do user research.
Yep.
And think about the way to form that sort of feedback, and to collect that feedback and then analyze that feedback. It's a very important and kind of black art that a lot of people are really, it's mysterious to a lot of people. So good for you for taking something that you already are growing skills in, and then applying it to the thing that you really wanted to do. So
yeah,
congratulations.
Yeah, I mean, my follow-on thought from that is that the history of game development is a history of a growing tent for developers. It started out as programmers. Literally, the first games were programmer only for, at least a decade. And then growing that to include artists, and then growing that to include this weird new thing called a designer. Like, literally, designers, I think you would say, were the third people in, which seems insane to think of today. But the tent has grown to include, for example, writers. Mm-hmm. Not a thing that were there, in the early, we talked about with Dark Forces how architects came in as level designers, which is a different sort of design. So the history of game development is a history of finding new disciplines that can be incorporated into its development, basically as its scale has grown. So when you talk about these sort of user research methodologies, you say it's black art. It's a black art to us. It's a black art to a programmer or a designer. But there are people who know how this stuff works. That's what I mean. They're working in peripheral fields, right? I mean, they're working in something else that is bigger and more established and has been around longer. And as games struggle to catch up with all of that stuff, because user research is probably there in film, for example, to pick another media that's not really that old. So it's an ever increasing tent as far as the skills that are needed to do it at a very high level. So to sort of call back to those earlier episodes that we had talked about how, hey, if you're trying to develop to be in sort of one of these traditional development roles, if you're a younger person, or maybe just a person who wants to do something different, here's how you might go about it. Versus, you're a person who actually has some skills that we're kind of growing into and needing. Those are two different things. And it's go.
Well, I have a new one for you, to give you an example, that is a growing one, that I would say user research is a good example of one sort of over the past 10 years or so that's become even more, prominent, with something like, with a company like Microsoft, especially, who has a whole user research department devoted to video games, right? And they hire psychologists.
And has had one for like 15 years. I mean, they're a
pioneer, progressive in that regard. But a new one that's kind of starting to pop up is actually economists. Mm-hmm. We actually hired one straight out of academia, never worked on a game before in his life. And he's coming at it because of his love for games and his knowledge for games, but also because he's a economy, PhD. So economics PhD. So we, because we want somebody to come in and think about things differently from that regard. And again, another sort of whole category of knowledge that game designers don't have by default. So and more companies are thinking about it that way, because the old school business models just aren't what they used to be, so
so you heard it here first, folks. Halo credits to be tied to the Fed rate. I'm reading between the lines a little bit, but okay. Anyway, congrats, baked potato. I love you with sour cream and bacon. So here's one from Mike Vogt. Subject is grit. It says, hello, Dev Game Club. As always, I'm loving your series on Diablo. I missed out on this first game as I wasn't into PC gaming at the time, but I was a huge fan of Diablo II. One comment in the last episode stood out to me. You guys were talking about how cumbersome it is to manage space in a player's backpack, and how they scrapped that system entirely for Diablo III. I only recently played Diablo III, and I was struck by how incredibly easy the game was to play. In fact, the game felt so streamlined that once the initial wow factor of the power fantasy wore off, there wasn't anything in the mechanics of the gameplay to keep me engaged, and I quickly lost interest. There's probably an industry term for it that I'm not aware of, but I've come to think of these mechanically interesting but probably not the cleanest design elements as grit, in quotes. Other examples would be the yellow orb system from Devil May Cry, the typewriter ribbon save system from Resident Evil, or just about any idea from early Monster Hunter games before Monster Hunter World cleaned up the series. I'm sure it's just coincidence that all those are Capcom games. Can you think of any examples from your careers when you could have made a choice to streamline a design, but opted to keep it gritty in order to keep it interesting for the player? Thanks, and take care, Mike Vogt. I mean, so there's two parts here. I mean, I would probably use friction rather than grit, but
yeah, that's what.
Grit is a pretty good word though, because it sort of suggests something.
Sort of the opposite. Yeah. In a way, well, low friction versus grit.
Right. Yeah. No, I mean something with like high friction is different from grit. Like grit turns into a pearl, so it's not quite the same thing. Like, so it's an interesting word choice. I like it. I like it a lot.
It is neat. In Dark Souls' case, then that grit does turn into a pearl. One might say
it does. Well, does it? I mean, so there's a lot of grit that's sanded away by the internet. So, like a lot of.
I'm not talking about the sort of knowledge grit. I'm more talking about the sort of execution grit.
Okay, yeah, fair enough. I mean? Yeah. So I sort of feel like any knowledge grit or friction these days, we have the internet, and it doesn't really exist. So why bother? Although I did try to play Dark Souls myself without looking at the internet, and put a lot of extra points into luck, which is a stat on the character.
How'd that work out for you?
Well, I'll just tell you that luck does not influence the game in any way whatsoever. It
really?
Literally has no impact on anything.
Why is it there?
For idiots like me, I guess. Like, I don't know.
Are you sure? That sounds crazy.
I know it sounds crazy, Tim, but I assure you it is a fact.
All right.
No, I we're kind of straying from Mike's point.
Yes.
So I love the term grit. I love the idea that it's like a little bit of sand in the works that's not quite the same as friction. I can't think of where I could have made a choice to streamline a thing myself. I mean, personally, certainly, but I'm not sure I can think of any. I mean, there's a fair amount of grit in Bethesda games, and I think that is a natural consequence of the way the games are made, and not so much of a conscious choice of let's keep it this way to make it more interesting. I think it's more we are throwing so much at you. Some of it is bound to be gritty, and that's a different thing. But that's also a choice. Like, let's make that choice to put tons and tons and tons of stuff in. So it is sort of a methodological choice, I think, at Bethesda. But it's not a choice I govern because I'm a coder. I want all of my code to be streamlined and grit free.
Yeah. I can't think of any specific examples that I think would be interesting enough. In fact, I think the kinds of games that I've been involved with, a lot of them have been, I would say, maybe a little more broad audience base, where we don't often want to have too much grit in there because of what we're trying to do with the projects, and obviously not all games do that. To some of his examples, but I guess some sort of obvious sort of cheap answers that I'm bummed I can't come up with better ones, tend to be focused around things like tuning and balancing when it comes to difficulty and resource management, whether it comes to ammunition, And when it in a case of something like a Tomb Raider, where we were going towards survival, more survival centric, then resources become more important when they hadn't been in the series before, right? So we would intentionally create grit, or the team would, when they were tuning and balancing things because of our goal for survival, to create that tension, right? You could obviously give the player lots of resources where they never have to worry about that, but then, like the typewriters in Resident Evil or what have you, or the herbs, then you wouldn't have that tension. So I don't know. That's kind of a general answer, but I can't think of any specifics where we thought to ourselves, let's
leave
add
that in, yeah, or add it, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
or leave
one development side example I have, I mean, this is purely development and not something the player sees, is that Darren Stinnett, who we interviewed for Dark Forces last, I don't know, June or so, maybe July, I don't recall exactly, but Darren was our boss on Starfighter, and one of the things he said to the programmers was that by default, the choices an artist can make should, that the defaults when an artist goes to do whatever, export, his model into the game, by default, those should be what will make the game fastest. So if they've tried to do something fancy in the art, it should take them some effort to put that in. For Starfighter, that might have been like a scratched surface where you could see something reflective underneath. So it's like a paint with a chrome beneath it or something like that. If we made that like the default all the time, then all of our models would have been slower to render. And so we introduced this step of, oh, okay, if you actually want this, you have to go and click this box, even though we could probably auto-detect it. I mean, there's probably a number of things that we could have done to make that smoother. His point was, look, you should have to work to make the game slower.
I don't think I don't remember him saying that.
It's probably not something he would have said to you.
Yeah, that's really...
It was very programming specific of like... It was, I mean, it's something I've complained. Like I've worked on, a couple projects, and I'm working on one now, and I've worked on one, shipped one on Unity. And one of my frustrations with Unity is all the bells and whistles are always turned on by default. And it's like, you know what? I don't need some cube rendered reflection mapping, sensing, whatever thing on every texture in the environment. But that's on by default, or what have you. I mean, it's just like, there's all these things where they've chosen the opposite, which is like, oh, to make it look super pretty, just leave it the way it is. And if you want to actually make it work faster, you have to do work. And that, I loved Darren's approach a little bit better, which is to make the game slower, you have to do work. Yeah, I mean, I thought that was an interesting bit of grit that we tried to approach development with on the Starfighter games.
Yeah, I mean, coming from the development side, that's definitely an unexpected answer that I like.
Yeah, you didn't even know we were doing that to you guys.
Well, I just
all those check boxes that we make you go through, and the OKs and et cetera on exports, we could automate all that shit.
That's true. I mean, yeah, there's that I didn't know that particular story, but also the fact that there can be grit on the development side that the player will never even see. Directly.
Yep.
It's interesting, as a quick aside to your story there, it's an interesting perspective, though, of kind of development mentality and where you do decide to give ownership over those sorts of things and where you don't, because the other school of thought is give the content team the free reign, right, and ownership over that stuff. And if things do become less performant, it's on them to fix it, right? And so there's sort of a sort of self-discipline moderation happening based on, if I put my hand in a fire, it'll burn, kind of thing, versus trying to sort of micromanage that stuff behind the scenes. And it's just sort of to speak to how development has migrated over the years when it comes to ownership versus control, and what the pros and cons of that there's pros and cons on both sides for sure, but what the pros and cons of that are. And in the Unity case, I would assume, though maybe you would know the actual answer, I would assume they would do that on purpose because they are in the business of selling their engine.
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah, exactly. I think that's exactly part of it. And for a lot of small projects you're going to make with it, it doesn't matter.
No, I know, but they don't care if you're not performant. That's on you.
Yeah, it's on you. Yeah.
So our engine's cool.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. No, I think that's exactly right. I think that's definitely the case with Unity. It's probably the case with Unreal, though I haven't worked with it since Republic Commando. There's this like, oh, our engine can do this. Like, why wouldn't you want it to do this cool thing, this buzzword X, Y, or Z? And the reason is, well, it's expensive to do X, Y, or Z. So having me select when I explicitly want to do X, Y, or Z, knowing it's expensive, is probably a better choice, since most of the time it's not noticeable. If you notice it, then you'll turn it on and you'll have made a choice. So we tried to err in that area, or in that direction rather, on Starfighter at least. A little less in our hands in Unreal with Republic Commando. So,
well, there's the other way to say it for me that I'm thinking through as you're speaking is like, there's also this sort of approach that's not just video games, but the Miyamoto has often been quoted as talking about the Zen garden approach, right? Where you're adding in or taking out only what you need versus putting everything in and then, overdoing it.
Right.
And so, start simple and only add in exactly what you need, because we tend to overdo it, and that seems like a better approach.
Yeah, well, as a person playing the Kingdom Hearts series, I can definitely say they don't follow the Nintendo school of thought. All right, I have a last note. I don't think there's any more email. Do you have email?
Okay. I don't have any more.
Okay. One last note. We did have another email. I'm not going to read it here. I'm just going to condense it down. Peter Baumgartner sent an email saying that they had released a making of Final Fantasy IX video that came out in the last couple of weeks, which has some good... What's that?
They who?
They, I believe, Square, yes.
Wow.
Which has some good information about the inspirations of the game or different elements of the game, such as the influences of Hawaii and the film The Dark Crystal. A couple of things to look at, probably a lot more, to be honest, but it's worth checking out. And I would look for it in our show notes. It'll be linked below. I want to thank Peter. I just wanted to condense that down just to that mention. He also had a game he wanted us to play. And I think that that one will probably see the light of day next year, and it's come up multiple times on the cast. So, but next year is its 25th anniversary. So astute listeners probably be able to figure out what that game might be. I don't include my co-host among the astute listeners.
A mystery. What could it be?
Possibly be. Okay. In any case, thanks for all the email. We get the feedback at devgameclub@gmail.com. You can, of course, follow the podcast on Twitter at devgameclub, or my co-host at
Tim Longo Jr. with a JR at the end.
I want to briefly aside into next time. You will be able to find either at devgameclub and possibly at Tim Longo Jr. with the JR at the end how far to play in our next game. But we're gonna take a weird aside. We've been playing this weird variety of games lately. A lot of RPGs, including sort of this action RPG in Kingdom Hearts, and now another action RPG on the Western side in Diablo. We're gonna go back across the Pacific Ocean to Japan for Devil May Cry, hack and slash game from publisher gone from brain.
Capcom.
It's Capcom, yes. And look at sort of a hack and slash, more of a beat 'em up, not really an RPG, I don't think. It's not a game I don't think either of us have played. But sort of that.
It's actually
what?
It's actually a genre that I don't tend to. It's that sort of like beat 'em up.
High style, beat 'em up game. Yeah, it's not a thing I play a lot of either. It's sort of a single player fighting game in a way, to a certain extent. It's not the sort of thing that either one of us play a ton of, but with the very positive response to Devil May Cry 5 out a few weeks ago now, it seemed like it was time to take a look at the series, and so we shall. Check on the Twitter to see until where we'll be playing. I'll have to spend a little time this week to figure that out. In any case, you can also find me occasionally streaming on twitch.tv/BrettDuville and the podcast at devgameclub.com. But for now, I hope you enjoy playing games this week, and good night.
Good night.